for that one. So if
Mm-hmm.
I think you're past the point of being able to say that I was into it before it was cool,
Right.
because it's already pretty cool. But you're still not too late to say that I read it and I knew about it and I liked it before the movie came out. So
Yeah, well, I'd heard. Is it going to be a movie or is it going to be a TV show? Or is it going to be both?
both. It's going to be a movie and a TV
Okay.
show and a video game that also like ties officially into the story.
Oh, everything is about world building now, isn't it?
Oh, dude, Rothfuss is the king of world building a little bit in this story. Like everything feels so like natural and like consistent in the world, and it's fantastic. I can't say enough good things about it. But that's not what we're really here to talk about.
Right.
Something that really struck me, and we can kind of use this to start to segue into the Civil War stuff, unless you have anything else that you really want to hit on here in Age of Ultron, because like there are so many great moments in this movie that we could just talk about for forever. Like at the beginning when Tony's like, "Please let it be a secret door." Yay!
Please be secret door. Please be secret door. Yeah.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
And like the whole opening sequence where we get to see all of the Avengers like showcase their powers and like do the sweet combo moves, like that just rocks all like everything. But at the end, and when after Tony and Cap and Thor have had their conversation about the stone, about the Mind Stone, and
Yes.
Tony and Steve have their little conversation about where is home, for Steve, and he's like, this is I'm home here, like this is where I belong. And actually, that's another interesting thing that I just want to tag into real quick. That wasn't really what Whedon wanted to do with that moment. Like he wanted to give Cap a little bit more like uncertainty. And not give him that sense of being home, and like sort of leave him, unmoored a little bit in that sense, which would have been a really interesting thing to do. But I kind of like it, honestly, because Captain America, and obviously in our current like cultural climate, like being somebody of consistent and unshakable conviction is not a terribly like, hip and cool thing to be.
Right.
But I think if you take Captain America too far away from that sense of righteousness that he has, even though again, in the current cultural climate, you could easily just dismiss it as being a cliche. I think you take away a really central part of what makes Captain America work as a character, and you can cast doubt on those convictions, and you can cause him to question those convictions and what it's all what's the foundation for it all. But I think at the end of the day, he needs to be in a position where he knows who he is and why he is doing the things that he's doing. And to leave him in that sort of, unmoored status, I think does a disservice to that character.
Well, is there a way?
Sorry.
Is there a way to kind of balance out that that sense of conviction and moral righteousness that you and I both appreciate with the reality of him still kind of being, this man out of time? And I think if Whedon had gotten his way, he probably would have, found a way to balance that out, better. And you kind of wonder how much of that was him, how much of that was the studio, because he makes it somewhat clear in either the commentary for Age of Ultron or some things that came out afterwards, is that there was a lot of studio meddling in this particular production and things that they wanted that he didn't necessarily want. And so they said, well, if you don't do this, we won't let you do that, kind of thing. So it kind of makes me wonder, how it might have turned out different.
Yeah. So anyway, all of that whole thing, to finally get to what I said I actually wanted to touch on, is that when Tony then, after all of those conversations, is driving away in his car,
Mm-hmm.
this struck me on this last rewatch more than it ever did before. Like, he is genuinely haunted by everything that has happened, in these events that we've just seen. And the weight of the decisions that he has made, and everything that Tony does, basically, I think, is really fueled primarily by his ego.
Absolutely.
I think that's really what makes him, the villain of this piece. And Whedon's commentary makes that very clear. I'm intentionally putting Tony in the role of the villain for this. And, I mentioned to you before we started recording, it's kind of like, and just because he's the villain doesn't mean that he's a bad guy.
Right.
Like in Wreck-It Ralph, when they're in the bad guy sort of support little group there, and Zangief from Street Fighter says to him, "Just because you are a bad guy does not make you bad guy."
Right.
And and that's an interesting thing that we can just think about in everybody's life. Like there's some, I think there's a little hook there that we can hold on to, or we can grab onto, that the circumstances of your story and the role that you've been cast into by factors beyond your control does not have to define who you are as a person. If you're in a job that you just feel is going nowhere and not good for anything, or if you feel like you're perceived as in a way that you don't want to be, that doesn't have to define who you actually are, and you still get to make choices about how you move through those parts of your life.
I think that even if you end up in a scenario one time or another, and to kind of quote Obi-Wan Kenobi, from a certain point of view, where you maybe have been cast as the villain by someone or someone's else in relation to how they see things, that does not necessarily mean that is what you actually are in concrete reality. And sometimes when those kind of things happen, we need to have others around us that are able to have a more objective view than we do. And I know in relation to, as we move into kind of the Civil War part of this conversation, there's that moment late in Civil War where Widow comes to Tony, where Natasha comes to Tony and says, "Do you have the capacity to let go of your ego for 1 second?" And she's really the only one that I think both sides have a good enough relationship with, regardless of what's happening around them, where she would be able to fulfill that role of being able to call something out in someone objectively in terms of the actual reality. Because that's part of what she does even in Age of Ultron. I know there was a lot of controversy, and you talked about a little bit in the Age of Ultron episode, between the way the relationship between her and Bruce Banner was written. But the great thing about that is she's the one who's trying to objectively get Bruce to essentially get the stick out of his butt, and then look around at the rest of the team and realize that not only he and she are the only ones suffering on the team as a result of what Wanda had done to their minds. Everybody was suffering, but Bruce was so focused on his own suffering that he couldn't see it.
You know what I think is really fascinating is, as you were just saying that, you used the word objectively twice in terms of something that the character of Natasha Romanoff is doing, and I find that hilariously ironic, given
Right.
what her function on the team is.
Yes, but I think that's one of the things that actually, I've stood by this for a number of years. I think that's one of the things that actually makes her the most interesting of all of the characters that have been cast in the Avengers. She may not be my favorite.
Mm-hmm.
That's still Phil Coulson, but
Yeah.
she is still like the most interesting in terms of her story arc and where she's been placed and what she's walking through and how she deals with it. And that's why I know that this weekend, I know you had mentioned it before, that Red Sparrow movie that's released, and part of how that's kind of unofficially tied to Marvel and getting Kevin Feige to actually do what we've been waiting for him to do.
Right.
But that the interestingness of her story arc is what puts me in a place where 3 or 4 years ago I was saying, like, I want the Black Widow movie now, not 5 years from now.
Yeah. So one last thing I want to just mention before we really start to lean into the Civil War part of our conversation is that at the tail end of the movie, it's literally within the last 30 seconds of the film, there's a moment that never fails to just take my breath away, and that is when you see Wanda, sort of in the lineup of the Avengers, and
yes,
and her entire countenance has just changed. She like the first time I saw that, like, I think the first thing that came to my mind is, like, she looks whole. She doesn't have the dark eye makeup on anymore. She is radiant. She just glows because she is, even though she's lost her twin brother. I think that's, really irony. Like, a huge part of her is gone now.
Mm-hmm.
But the way that she looks, when she turns towards the camera there, as Steve is about to, assemble them,
yes,
once again, it just never fails to take my breath away. The way that they just were able to completely change the countenance of this character as she, sort of steps into this, way more heroic role, and has gotten off this path of revenge.
Well, and I think real quick, I think that speaks a lot to Hawkeye's role in her life, right? The fact that at her worst point, you had somebody else who was essentially willing to step into her story, step into her mess, and say, yes, this is crazy. I'm here fighting robots with a bow and arrow, and we can't necessarily make sense of all that's happening around us, but I'm here. You're not alone. We have a job to do. You need to decide whether or not you are going to be involved in doing that job or not. But if you decide yes, you need to be fully and completely committed to doing this job. And when you get to the very end and you see her standing like that, she's in that place of she's committed. She's ready to go. And whatever the next thing is, she's ready for it.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's go ahead and move on to the next thing so that we can start to bring this in for a landing.
All right.
So we've already had like a full-on discussion about Civil War, so we're just going to hit a couple of highlights. And so here's something that literally occurred to me for the very first time today. And I know this is going to completely wreck my cred as any sort of like useful commentator on the MCU, but here it goes anyway. As I was driving over here to where I record today, it occurred to me all in a moment that the narrative spine of each of all three Captain America movies is Steve's friendship with Bucky.